My late mother was in my Donner concentration camp. Every single member of my family on my father's side,
the Jews did not take arms against the
my
Germans.
late father was in Auschwitz concentration camp. My late mother was in my Donner concentration camp. Every single member of my family on both sides was exterminated. Both of my parents were in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising. And it's precisely and exactly because of the lessons my parents taught me and my two siblings that I will not be silent when Israel commits its crimes against the Palestinians. And I consider nothing more despicable than to use their suffering and their martyrdom to try to justify the torture, the brutalization, the demolition of homes that Israel daily commits against the Palestinians. So I refuse any longer to be intimidated or browbeaten by the tears. If you had any heart in you, you would be crying for the Palestinians, not for what's been done.
Welcome, fellow plebs. My name is Sean, and this is
Tribunus Plebis.
Hey everybody, welcome back to the podcast. It's good to have you back. Today, I'm going to talk about something that I did not think I'd ever really talk about on here, to be honest with you. In fact, it's one of the two things that when I started this podcast, I wanted to basically avoid. And now it's the second one that I'm going to be talking about. The first was race relations in this country. That one ended up being episode 3 after the murders of Ahmaud Arbery and George Floyd. The second one is today, and it's Israel and Palestine, the Gaza Strip and the West Bank, and all of the violence that's going on there right now. If you've been anywhere near the news this past week, I'm sure you've at least heard about this. Now, there are lots of reasons I did not want to deal with Israel here. Some of them good, some others probably bad, but the biggest one, and maybe the worst one, was, well, just simple cowardice. If I'm to be honest with all of you, I am not a very brave man. And Israeli-Arab tensions and battles and the occupation of the West Bank and the open-air prison of Gaza is just fraught as hell to even talk about. In fact, last episode, I talked a bit about the BDS movement, a movement aimed at boycotting Israeli companies in a bid to change how they deal with Gaza and Palestine and Arabs in and around that country. If you go back and listen, or hell, maybe if you can just even remember my words, I said at least 2 times that I did not care about how anyone felt about the situation in Israel and, so on. And it was true as far as that went. I didn't care because that episode wasn't really about Israel per se. It was about free speech. But I was so careful, and I said that, I made those caveats 2 times because I didn't even want to dip my toe into this mess. But just, a week and a half later or so, here I am about to dive in. So when it comes to Israel and Palestine and Gaza and all this stuff, I've been saying it's complicated for years now. And I think that there is some truth to this as it relates to history and complicated politics and cultural and religious issues. But really when I said it's complicated, it was just a coward's way of not saying anything so nobody could say that I hated Jewish people or hated Arabs or called me anti-Semite or collaborator or warmonger or whatever else could have been said about me. It was just fear. Complicated became an easy out. What do I think about what's going on in Gaza? Well, it's complicated. I haven't really looked into it deeply enough. It was an easy out. Like I said, an easy out. And now I want to play you folks a clip The clip is of a man named Michael Brooks, and it's gone viral over the past few days. Michael Brooks had a podcast called The Michael Brooks Show. It ran for several years before Michael suddenly and tragically passed away last year. Michael was my favorite podcaster and political analyst. And yes, it's weird that I'm saying I have a favorite political analyst. What the hell have I become? But he was really bright and really good at what he was doing and was a big inspiration to even do my own podcast. So in this clip, the late, great Michael Brooks disabuses me of "It's complicated." Here's the clip.
Are you not concerned about the binary between either condemning Israel entirely, being like also a stance that a lot of like very strong and notorious anti-Semitic people agree with, versus like, you know, seeing this as more of a complex issue where it is wrong what's going on and that there's also a way to do this, that Israel still exists and is supported?
So it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. And just as like a thought experiment, IDW people, if we know that if somehow a population of Jewish refugees ended up in West Bank and Gaza, and an Arabic government in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv had an open-air prison in Jewish Gaza, which they bombed with white phosphorus, they killed civilians indiscriminately, and they had no provisions for medicine. They had an embargo that blocked food, that electricity wasn't running, that there was an over 48% unemployment rate, life expectancy and malnutrition statistics were horrifying. One of the major policymakers in this hypothetical Arabic Palestinian state said, we need to put those Jews on a diet. In the West Bank, there was another Jewish area where there was a little bit more autonomy, but there was regular Arabic settlements where they pulled up the Jewish farmers' foods, they terrorized them with rocks, the security forces broke children's bones, and they couldn't drive on their own roads. We'd all have no problem understanding what that was. So there's nothing complex about it.
And that's it. It's not complicated. We can all see it. Before we go on, I just want to tell you that this clip is actually a response to a follow-up question. And for context, I'm going to put the entire 7-minute clip at the end of the podcast. If you're interested in a little more, in-depth of an answer with a little more context, it will be there. So what do I say from here? If this was a video show, I'd show you the videos of the decimation of Gaza. The apartment buildings leveled that will likely never be rebuilt because of draconian sanctions and blockades that prevent construction materials from even entering the occupied territories. I probably wouldn't show the dead babies and children, but I might show the orphans who will grow up in that open-air prison. Those destined to become, at best, second-class citizens in that apartheid state. But they will almost certainly never leave those walls and fences for any extended period of time for their entire lives. I'd show the asymmetric response to rockets, the Arab protesters being gunned down, maybe the theft of homes that preceded the whole thing. Now, when Ned Price, the spokesman for the State Department, spoke with reporters and they asked him about the situation, he couldn't even condemn the murder of babies. In fact, here's the question and the answer, just so people hear it.
I don't want to harp on this either, but the Israelis killed 13 people just now, including maybe 5 or 6 children. Do you condemn that? Do you condemn the killing of children?
Saeed,
I'm asking, do you condemn the killing of Palestinian children?
Obviously, and these reports are just emerging, and I understand, I was just speaking to the team, I understand we don't have independent confirmation of facts on the ground yet, so I'm very hesitant to get into reports that are just emerging. Obviously, the deaths of civilians, be they Israeli or Palestinians, are something we would take very seriously.
Now, I don't know about you guys, but that makes me feel really gross. There's another point here where Ned Price is asked about the principle of self-defense in regard to this current situation, and he says that he will not comment on Israel's grossly disproportionate airstrikes and violence and would only talk about rockets fired into Israel.
When you talk about supporting Israel's right to defend itself, that includes, I'm assuming, but correct me if I'm wrong, that includes their retaliatory strikes against Hamas targets in Gaza, right?
We're speaking of the principle of self-defense.
I'm asking if you think that the principle of self-defense applies to the retaliatory, the airstrikes that they're conducting in response.
Matt, this is a very fluid situation. I would hesitate to comment on operations beyond, the rocket fire that is clearly targeting innocent civilians in Israel. So I would hesitate to speak to specific operations that have just occurred, but the broader principle of self-defense is something we stand by.
Again, too terrified to even acknowledge the asymmetric response and the atrocity that it is. He would also go on to suggest that Israel has a right to defend itself, but he balked at the idea that Gaza did, or that the Arabs did, or Palestine does.
Said.
Thank you, Matt. I want to ask you about East Jerusalem, but let's talk about what you said about the principle of self-defense. Does that in any way apply to the Palestinians? Do they have a right to self-defense? Do Palestinians have a right to self-defense?
In broadly speaking, Said, we believe in the concept of self-defense. We believe it applies to any state. I don't think that. I certainly wouldn't want my words to be construed as.
I understand. I want to ask.
Again, he was too terrified to even acknowledge the asymmetric response and the atrocity that it is. You remember those people who, when you asked them if Black Lives mattered, and they'd stutter and stammer and say, well, all lives matter, because they just couldn't bring themselves to acknowledge the situation? It was like that. It was like, well, everyone can defend themselves, I guess. Instead of just saying, like, yeah, the Palestinians can defend themselves. They're human beings. But that would betray a cardinal rule of American politics, to admit that Israel did anything at all that wasn't wonderful. And that shit just has to stop. Now, do I have some great answer to fix what's going on? No, I don't. I wish I did. I wish I could wave a wand and make beautiful peace and rainbows happen all over the world, but I can't. The apartheid laws and state has to end. Gaza can no longer be the massive open-air prison that it is. The West Bank has to be let go. Shit has to change, and the international community has to stop apologizing and covering for this nonsense and plainly illegal actions. And by the way, when I say international community there, that's, it's probably too broad, because it's primarily the United States. Okay, so I guess that's it for, direct Israel and Palestine talk for right now. I just don't know how much more I can add to it personally. I just really hope that the people who are watching what has been going on for the past few days and are horrified can maintain that horror and demand change before they slip back into the comfort of the New York Times and CNN Thorazine hazes that they wander around in 24/7, 365. And this isn't even a political thing. It's not about right versus left or whatever. It's about basic humanity. It's about how my politics, my views on the world, my morality, I guess, reject all of this shit. Like, yeah, sure, rockets are bad, without a doubt. But so is the prison we call Gaza. Gaza, as a prison colony, is just fucking wrong. And Gaza and Arabs and Palestine and Palestinians, they have a duty and a right to protect themselves. In fact, I'd go so far as to say that they have a duty to resist their imprisonment. And take a look at how our U.S. media is reporting on this. The coverage is entirely lopsided, but the passivity of their voice is really the thing that keeps jumping out at me. Rockets are fired from Gaza with murderous intent. And bombs that end up blowing up in Gaza, they have no, they have no launch point. The bombs just appear. They're just bombs that appear from nowhere. Israeli grenades simply end up in mosques full of people, and Palestinians just die. No word as to how. But Israelis are actively murdered. Stun grenades aren't hurled by Israeli soldiers into Al-Aqsa Mosque. They end up in the mosque. Rubber bullets aren't fired into the crowd. Rubber bullets simply hit people. Tear gas isn't purposefully loaded, aimed, and fired. Clouds of tear gas simply drift over the worshippers. You see how insane this is, right? And let me just revisit a point I made a couple minutes back and the whole self-defense question. This Israel has a right to defend itself brings up another point here as well that involves the media. Most of the Western media that most of us consume is implying, and by implying I mean lying, or simply ignoring, or perhaps just downplaying it, but they are implying that this whole outbreak of violence started with rockets being fired from Gaza. That's the incitement in their stories. But the story doesn't really begin there. It begins with Israeli settlers physically throwing Arab families out of their homes and taking them, which was happening en masse in the East Jerusalem neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. This violence, the police literally throwing Arabs from their homes of several decades and ushering in new families, was the real spark to this whole mess. And we might, from this point here, ask why this happened. Why did these settlers begin to suddenly evict Arabs who had lived in homes for decades and just simply steal their homes from them? Well, the more skeptical of us might note that Benjamin Netanyahu, the current Prime Minister of Israel, has been unable to form a governmental coalition and will soon be facing what is expected to be a difficult election. In the States, we have this down-home truism that presidents seeking re-election or just trying to be replaced by someone from their own party, well, they start wars. And you know what? This isn't just an American thing. Netanyahu okayed the settlers to take those homes. He allowed them to keep going when Arabs were begging him to stop. Then, the Palestinians defended themselves. Now Netanyahu is refusing to even consider a ceasefire which is being sought by Hamas. In fact, Benny Gantz, alternate Prime Minister and Minister of Defense of Israel, refused to consider the ceasefire and said that as long as Israelis fear rocket attacks, then Gaza will burn. So why doesn't the American media start with the illegal evictions or hammer Israel for refusing to even consider a ceasefire? The answer here is it's because the media is running their U.S.-sanctioned narrative full force and ignoring anything that might take away from it. Oh, and before I go on to the next thing that I want to talk about, I want to bring up this idea of human shields. Israel tends to tell us that they blew up that school or that hospital or that apartment building because there was a rocket launcher in it or some group of militants or something hiding in it, and they blew it up and dozens of civilians are killed or wounded, and Israel says, well, they were using them as human shields. That's their justification for those casualties. That they knew the innocents were there, but they had to kill them to get to the bad guys. They literally just tell you that they don't care about the human shields. They just shoot and bomb through them. Because the Arabs in Gaza, they aren't quite worthy of being considered human beings. They're just some meat that's in the way of the goal. They tell us very clearly that they don't care beyond their crocodile tears and some flaccid words like, we wish we didn't have to do that. You didn't have to do it, but you did. Why won't the media speak on that? In fact, let's take a harder look at the media in this episode. Here is a bit from a New York Times article. It's only 2 sentences long, but notice the difference in how the two are written. Quote, more than 67 Palestinians, including 16 children, have died since the start of the conflict on Monday, Palestinian health officials said. The rockets fired by Hamas and its Islamist ally, Islamic Jihad, killed at least 6 Israeli civilians, including a 5-year-old boy and a soldier. End quote. Okay, so let's take these 2 sentences one at a time. The first sentence says, more than 67 Palestinians, including 16 children, have died. Just died. Just died. Passively just passed away. No discernible cause to their deaths. They just died. Now, the second sentence is written a little differently. It says that rockets fired by Hamas and its Islamist ally, Islamic Jihad, killed at least 6 Israeli civilians, including a 5-year-old boy and a soldier. So the Israelis are actively killed by a named enemy, a victim and a killer. There is nothing passive there. The weapons are launched by specific people, active language. People are killed. They did not just die. Active versus passive wordings. The Israeli victims are further identified as civilians, and the 5-year-old as a boy. This is done to engender sympathy, and so is the noting of a soldier at the end of the sentence. The Israelis are civilians. Rhetorically, they are saying they are innocent. Why aren't the Palestinians referred to as civilians? None of them were civilians? Not even the 16 children? The answer is that they can't be civilians, and therefore innocents, if the Western news organization that wrote this story wants to place all the blame on the Palestinian people in Gaza. When Palestinians are just a number, it is intentional, and it's to diminish sympathy. It's to void them as human beings in the reader's minds. Israelis are actively killed. Palestinians passively die. Hamas kills. The IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, is just there when people die. On their own. Passively. And it's really important to really pay attention to what you're reading and really notice how it's written. And yes, these words and phrasings do matter. And they matter a lot. They change the very nature of the sentence you are reading, and those sentences change the meaning of the paragraphs, and all of those changed paragraphs all change the overall narrative and tone of the story. It is absolutely insidious. These writers, they cast the players as villains or heroes. They assign righteousness or prurient violence to the characters of the play. In short, they tell you how to think about, interpret, and synthesize what is supposedly going on without you even noticing. And we buy it. We accept it. Gaza prisoners just passively die. Israelis, though, are murdered by Gazans. This is Propaganda 101, guys. We've talked about othering a bunch of times on this podcast. This is part of that. Dehumanize the people you want to demonize and humanize the ones you want to paint as heroes. It's simple and effective because most of us don't really notice this shit when we read or hear the news. We need to do better. We need to be more literate of the media we consume. We need to spot the lies and omissions and narrative-changing phrases. Gaza is under attack by an apartheid state. We need to see that. We need to understand that there is nothing here that even approaches equivalence. This is the occupied versus the occupier. A massive, incredibly strong, well-trained, and well-equipped, thanks to the United States, army versus no fighting force of note, armed with no weapons of note. Over 5 decades of Gaza as an open-air prison full of refugees versus the most powerful country in the region and one of the most powerful in the world. The disparity of power and threat is absurdly tilted. It is, indeed, very simple. And that's the end of the episode, folks. And it was probably the hardest, scariest, and least fun episode I've had to do so far. Well, we absolutely hope that we find peace all over the world, the Middle East and between Palestine and Israel, including Gaza and the West Bank. We at Tribunus Plebis Media stand with Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank, and anyone in Israel who is working to end these war crimes and atrocities. And so as a change here, I'm not going to ask you fine folks to rate or review or anything like that, but I am going to link to a few Gaza and West Bank charities that do good work and ask that anyone with an extra $1 or $5 to donate and help out if at all possible. You will find the links in the description of this episode no matter where you're listening to it. Thank you. I love you all, and we will play you out on that longer Michael Brooks clip I promised you. It is about 7 minutes long. Please listen, enjoy, think about it. Goodbye.
Hi.
Hi.
So my first question, it says on your Twitter that you're Jewish. Am I getting this right?
No.
Is it the right Twitter?
On my Twitter bio, it says I'm Jewish?
No, but like in your tweets. I don't want to be wrong.
I have Jewish background. I'm just trying to think of...
Okay, so as someone with a Jewish background,
yes.
How do you feel about Bernie's plan for Israel, especially as someone concerned with foreign policy?
I love it. It's an absolutely necessary. My Jewish values teach me to oppose apartheid.
Okay. Could you elaborate, please?
I mean, there really isn't that much to elaborate on. I mean, has anybody ever been not only to Israel but also to the? Have you been to? Have you been to the West Bank? Have you been to Gaza?
Yep.
You went to Gaza?
I went to the border.
Oh, okay, but not to Gaza.
You can't be in Gaza.
Well, I know people who've gone to Gaza. You could definitely go to Gaza. So for me, my politics are built on a base of, economic justice and actually really like anti-racism, as in some ways as distinct from some of this sort of woke stuff in a way. But when I was already, I grew up, I was pretty connected to left politics, so I always knew growing up about the travesty that was the human rights situation there. And I knew that people I admired, like Nelson Mandela said, South Africa is going to not be properly free until the Palestinians are free. In 2006, I believe, I read a piece by a guy named Tony Judt in the New York Review of Books, who was a really important Jewish scholar. And he just said, the argument was that, literally this is childish. The idea that you have an ethno-state or a religious state, if you're committed to any type of broad-based social, economic equity and civil society, it doesn't work. No matter how justified, right? Of course there's justification because of Jewish history for Israel. There's justification for Kurdistan because of Kurdish reality. There's justification for Pakistan. It's notable that Israel and Pakistan are both disasters. Israel not in the sense of, look, if you're a European Jewish background, you have a nice life there. If you're not, you are, even inside 67 borders, not a fully equal citizen. And the situation in the West Bank is, it is literally Jim Crow-like, and Gaza is, it's just an atrocity. So that's not something that anybody could reasonably ask me to support. And I understand, there's some actions from some Palestinian groups that, we can condemn. In fact, those have not even really been in any way seriously in play since 2003. And when we talk about, look, and the apartheid word specifically is both used by people who were crucial in ending apartheid in South Africa, like Desmond Tutu or Ronnie Kasrils, who served as intelligence minister under Mbeki, who I've interviewed. And the other main people who use the apartheid word are Ehud Olmert and Ehud Barak. So it is what it is. And I don't support second-class citizenship and occupation and sieges for anybody, no matter who they are.
Are you not concerned about the binary between either condemning Israel entirely, being also a stance that a lot of very strong and notorious anti-Semitic people agree with, versus seeing this as more of a complex issue where it is wrong what's going on and there's also a way to do this that Israel still exists and is supported?
So it's not a complex issue. That's the big thing. It's super simple. There's one group that has enormous power. It's the most powerful country in the Middle East. It's backed by the United States. It acts on another population of people with total impunity and is never held accountable for anything. So there's no symmetry in the relationship, period. And just as like a thought experiment, IDW people, if we know that if somehow a population of Jewish refugees ended up in West Bank and Gaza, and an Arabic government in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv had an open-air prison in Jewish Gaza, which they bombed with white phosphorus, they killed civilians indiscriminately, and they had no provisions for medicine. They had an embargo that blocked food, that electricity wasn't running, that there was an over 48% unemployment rate, life expectancy and malnutrition statistics were horrifying. One of the major policymakers in this hypothetical Arabic Palestinian state said, we need to put those Jews on a diet. In the West Bank, there was another Jewish area where there was a little bit more autonomy, but there was regular Arabic settlements where they pulled up the Jewish farmers' foods, they terrorized them with rocks, the security forces broke children's bones, and they couldn't drive on their own roads. We'd all have no problem understanding what that was. So there's nothing complex about it. The second part of your question, it's a pure asymmetry relationship. And the question is rights or not. So that's it. It's not complicated. The second part of your question, at this point, there's always going to be crackpots who are anti-Semitic who condemn Israel. That's not what drives the movement, particularly in the United States. If you work around most people who are concerned with this issue, it's actually populated with a lot of Jewish people. The real question we have to ask is, why is it that AIPAC is hosting an information minister for Slobodan Milosevic? Why is it that there's relationships between the Israeli government and far-right parties in Europe? Why is it that Benjamin Netanyahu's son is posting borderline alt-right memes? Why is it that Israel is an alt-right state, even though it is from the descendants of the victims of one of the greatest crimes in history? That's a serious question, and that's inseparable from the racism of the project, which goes back to the first part that we have to solve. But thank you. Shalom. And I am serious about it coming from Jewish values. Like Tony Judd, my reading, to the extent I do, which I actually do have some connection to that in a religious sense, it's unacceptable for me. But yeah, no, I know. We'll but it's not complicated.